I found this kind of interesting. This is from the website Bernie 2016, which is a new one to me. A writer there posted this, I think, 2 days ago. The heading is "What's Killing the American Middle Class," and the writer is a guy, Richard Eskow, and he says a new study by the Pew Research Center spurred a rash of headlines last week about the dying middle class. I remember reading that in, I guess, in the New York Times. But Richard says the word dying would be more appropriate if we were watching the regrettable but inevitable effects of natural forces at work. But we're not. We're seeing the fruits of deliberate action and sometimes deliberate inaction at the highest levels of power. In other words, this is not Richard's words, but the dying middle class is not dying from, I don't know, say old age. It's dying because it's being murdered, the middle class. We know this. Bernie Sanders has been talking about this for the year that he's been a candidate. Anyway, Richard says the great American middle was never large enough, even at its height. It always excluded too many people, sometimes shamefully, merely for their skin color. And now, instead of growing and becoming more inclusive, it's fading away instead. Now, I know I have a lot of people who listen to this program who are no longer working, not because they've lost their jobs, but because they have retired. I know I also have a lot of people listen to this program who are not working because they may be overqualified. God damn, I hate that word, to find a job, or maybe they have just given up because it's so difficult to find work that makes sense. So I think we have a pretty good spectrum of people who it concerns, middle class or working class or what have you. Anyway, Richard says it's true that the middle class is dying, but not from natural causes. Here he says it's being killed. What, and for that matter, who is responsible for its slow death? Well, you know, this is a literary device, or journalistic device. You ask the question and then you answer it in the context of what you're writing. And he says it's important to understand just how, because we know what's causing the slow death. We know. But he says it's important to understand just how dramatic this decline has been. The Pew study found that the size of the middle class fell in virtually all parts of the country between 2000 and 2014. Now, the first part of that was the Bush years. The second part of that were the Obama years, under the control of the same people who ran things during the Bush years, the Republicans in Congress. But I digress. 9 out of 10 metro areas showed a decline in middle-class households, Richard writes, according to this Pew study. And in a related study, Pew Research also found that the median income for middle-class households fell by nearly 5% between 2000 and 2014. Their median wealth, that would be assets, everything, minus debt, everything, declined by 28% after the housing market crisis and subsequent Great Recession. That's no surprise, is it? Battleground electoral states like Indiana and Michigan saw the greatest decline in middle-class incomes, a finding that may help explain this year's widespread dissatisfaction with the status quo among some voters. You think? It's true, Richard writes, that some households moved into the upper income tier even as others fell into the lower income range, but that doesn't necessarily make them oligarchs. There's also considerable inequality among the top 20% of households, and even among the top 1%. Well, you know, whatever inequalities exist between the top 1%, I don't give a rat's ass about. You know what I'm saying? I just don't. Pew's middle class range went from an average lower income in 2014 of $44,083 to $144,250 for a family of 4. That was the range. $44,000 on the low end, $144,000 on the high end. There's your middle class, according to Pew. Households whose earnings were higher than that were considered, obviously, higher income. Now, as Richard writes, 144 grand sounds like a lot of money, and it is, especially when 47 million Americans are living in poverty. But that doesn't even qualify 144,000 a year for the top 5% of households' incomes. A household needed an income, annual income, of just under $500,000 to make it into the top 1% in 2014. Now, that's even worse than it looks. Richard says or writes, the middle class isn't what it used to be. Lower and middle income wages have been stagnating for a long time. Middle wage, hourly wages only rose 6% between 1979 and 2013. Can you believe that? Now, what do you suppose the combined inflation rate was during that time, 1979 to 2013? Anyway, in the same period, low-wage workers' income fell by 5%. Wages fell by 5%. At the very same time, high-wage earners saw a 41% increase in income. He goes on, talks about a lot of stuff here, but he says families today can be in the so-called middle in terms of income and yet still not make enough to live on. The Economic Policy Institute calculated the amount of money needed to maintain a four-person household in different parts of the country, and they found that it took $49,114 and $106,493 per year. To maintain a four-person household in different parts of the country. In some parts of the country, 49 grand will do it. Other parts of the country, 106,000. $44,083, the lower end of the number I just gave you of Pew's middle class income range, was not an adequate income anywhere in the country. The lowest number is $49,000. No matter where you live, if you're a family of four and the family income is not $49,000, you're hurting. You can't live on it, right? And yet the low end of the middle class, according to the Pew Research, is $44,000. So if you're in the middle class, you're making $45,000 a year. You can't live on it, a family of four, if you're going to live what is considered an American way of living. Now, if you want to get off the grid, if you want to live, there are ways to live where you can live on 10 grand a year. Shit, I've done that. But I didn't have a family of four. I just had me. And it's probably more like 6 grand a year. Costs have risen dramatically for many large dollar items that affect middle-class families, including college tuition and out-of-pocket costs under employer health care plans. Retirement security has evaporated as corporate retirement plans offer less in benefits. A lot of corporations don't offer anything. They'll match maybe 1/3 of what you put into a 401k, over which you have zero control. I, and a lot of people who are still alive and kicking, we all remember the days when you went to work for a company and you had your wages and you had your health insurance and you had vacations, but you also had a guaranteed retirement. You know, that was the only upside of going, other than the satisfaction that a person would get out of working on an assembly line, for example, in an auto plant. But the only upside, materialistic upside, was the fact that you knew after 25 or 30 years of this drudge work, 30 and out was what they used to say in Toledo. 30 and out. If you went into the factories at 20, because your family couldn't afford to send you to college, and you got out of got out of high school and maybe served 2 years in the military, and you just didn't feel qualified to take the GI Bill and try to go to school, so you went into a factory. You could go into the factory and earn a good wage for the times, a real good wage. And at the end of 30 years, you'd be 50, and you had a nice retirement package waiting for you. And if you lived another 15, 16 years, then you would also have Social Security. The catch was not so many people lived beyond, long enough to get their Social Security in those days. Anyway, the top 0.1%, that is 160,000 families in this country. There are 300 million people, 325 million people in this country. 160,000 families own as much wealth as 90% of the country as a whole, or about 145 million families. So 160,000 families own as much as 145 million families. And there's a group of just 536 people in the United States who had a shared net worth of nearly $3 trillion by the end of 2015. So, who's behind all of this? There's all the brain-numbing statistics. The question remains, who's doing this to the middle class? As if we didn't know. Again, Bernie Sanders has been talking about this since he declared his candidacy. The answer, according to Richard here, Richard Eskow, the answer to that question includes corporate executives who bend the rules, Wall Street bankers who break the rules, their lobbyists who work to change the rules, and the politicians who change in their favor in state houses, in the halls of Congress. Where else, Richard? In the executive and judicial branches. What were we talking about earlier tonight? About the right-wingers are going to coalesce behind Trump so they have a lock, if he gets elected, on the Supreme Court for the foreseeable future. Anyway, virtually all Republicans fit the description I just shared with you. And sadly, so do many Democrats. The rule bending takes the form of deregulation, a tolerance for ever larger corporate mergers, an unwillingness to enforce the law against bankers, and a plethora of tax breaks for corporations and wealthy individuals. Then there are those terrible trade deals, the defunding of public institutions, the neglect of our infrastructure, and laws that make it harder for workers to collectively bargain on their own behalf. But we finally get down to the question, why do we need a middle class anyway? The Koch brothers are single-handedly trying, there's two of them, and their group, but they're single-handedly trying to eliminate the middle class. What good is the middle? Well, you might say consumerism is what keeps the economy going. Buying shit in this country accounts for what? 80% of production goes to people, suckers, who buy this garbage. Now, we're not all suckers if we decide to buy a house that has a toilet inside or a sink or a stove. But you know what I mean. You know what I mean. The Koch brothers and their ilk have decided that the middle class is unnecessary. I've talked about this over the years. In the first place, the middle class is the seething cauldron of possible rebellion and maybe revolution. That's where revolution arises, from the middle class. So just I guess you would say from the perspective of a Marie Antoinette mindset, get rid of the middle class. Let them eat cake. Fuck them. Get rid of them. Because that's where they're going to bring out the guillotines, or the modern equivalent of. So destroy the middle class. It does two things. That reduces the threat of revolution, but it also provides slave labor. Because if you have no middle class, if you just have a poverty-stricken group of workers who will fight each other for a $5 an hour job, who will agree with the overlords that there shouldn't be child labor laws because, I've got 3 kids. What the hell are they doing staying home, eating all the groceries? Get them to work. There's a word for that historically. No, it's not that word. There's a word for it, an economic term, and I'm sure you know what it is.